start? Basically ready to go, Heather.
I'm okay. Oop, I'm now mic'd. I can hear myself.
You're live. That means it's official.
Okay.
All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone here today for our Ski Distinguished Lecture. I am super excited to get to introduce Sheelah Carpendale. Sheelah comes to us from the University of Calgary, where she's a professor and runs the InnoViz lab there, the research lab, as part of a large HCI group there. Sheelah's won lots of awards. I won't go on. Has published tons of papers. Inevitably, whenever I go to try to, do some background reading on some interesting new technique or some interesting new methodology, there's some road that always leads back to some paper from Sheelah or one of Sheelah's former students. So, Sheelah has a really, really interesting background both in computer science but also in visual arts. And she very much brings that perspective to the work that she does within the InfoViz and the HCI community. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariah. And yeah, it's been great to be here. I've been here, like half a day already, and it's super exciting. I've never actually been here before, and so it's really great to see. This is an amazing space that you have, and just amazing amount of research that's going on. There's a few things that I want to do at the beginning of this talk, kind of like housekeeping things. The first thing is I always actually like to acknowledge my students. This is my current group of students, and all of those at the top row are defending their PhD this semester, which is kind of drowning me. Yeah, but that's pretty cool. The other thing is, I said I'm going to talk about an informed society because it's very much the way I'm starting to think that this is kind of, that we have become a data society and that there's data everywhere, and that those of us who think about how to make data understandable have a sort of responsibility to figure out how to inform everybody, not just the experts. So it's kind of the direction I'm going in. But yeah, and actually Hans Rosling, who may single-handedly have done more to promote InfoViz than anybody, it was his very first talk that first woke me up to this. He talked about how that his students had a view of the world that was the view of that the world was in the 60s. And all of these talks he's been giving is to try and tell us that the world has changed, right? Because somehow or other, we have not kept up with the changing pace. And this shouldn't be happening. We've got more possibilities of communication than we've ever had. We should be informed. So what's going wrong? For me, I kind of think of this kind of like as a mesh. There's data and there's engagement, and I'm interested in both, and I'm interested in the interplay between them, and I think that doing both kind of supports each other. So I was going to just kind of go really quick through the sort of thing that everybody understands really well, the big data side, working closely with experts, developing a data understanding, tasks also are important, doing iterative development of viz, discussion, ideation until you get somewhere. We're kind of all really familiar with that. I think that keeping on doing that and having some part of my lab doing this kind of keeps us honest. It's like important to keep that going. I work with all kinds of domain experts. I'm just gonna flash up like 4 recent ones. So one about chemistry. So this is looking at free radicals and how they can self-neutralize in aqueous solutions, which actually is relevant to our health. Security experts, Android permissions data. Some of them are actually taking really scary permissions when you load them. Geosocial utility, which is sort of super important for industry, how you can anonymize it and still actually have usable data. Literary experts, I know that some of you, like Mariah, are working on this, and I don't know if you know this, but this is actually a mathematical space for language. This is the Oxford English Dictionary in 1D, and that's it in 2D. And this transformation is 1-to-1 and onto, so it means you could do math. For every sequence of letters, there is a unique spot. For every word, there is a spot. Who knew that English looks like a tartan? Anyway, it's like the notion of being able to do math with language, I don't know, but we still haven't done it, but just the possibility is exciting. So this is work we did with neurologists, which is actually looking at process and trying to speed up the diagnostic process so that people can get treated more quickly. More generally, I think that probably at least half of you know about fat fonts. So this is kind of a much more, those were all like working specifically with domain experts in particular type of data. This is kind of more general, like for Viz in general, like to actually put the data into the font so that you can dither with the actual numbers. So if you zoom in, you can actually read off the data. It's not zooming into blankness, it's zooming into the details. It's just right there embedded in the image. And you keep, 10% of every number for the next one down, so it keeps the proportion of data right. The 9 has 9 times as much ink as a 1. Yeah. And they had lots of fun coming up with different fonts. And yes, you can dither with, and if you want, if you're interested, fatfonts.org exists. They work in Word. You feel like playing with fat fonts yourself, you can. So that's the big data side, and the research questions kind of revolve around improving the quality and the power of representations, improving the usability, the ease, and the interaction of representations, getting the best fits with the stats or machine learning or AI, leveraging Viz for and machine learning or AI, doing what we've always wanted to do, enhancing our cognitive abilities, discovering the unexpected. But what we're developing is a new elite. And this new elite is those people who can think with data. And that's the data experts and people like us, right? That's not actually the whole of society. So what about all of these other things that are becoming increasingly important, like inclusivity and diversity? And how do we actually cope with that? How do we actually make this readable for everybody? It's like I said at the beginning, I do think that we are a data society. How can we actually keep it as an informed society? And we need this to be an informed society so that a lot what we value so much about our society, about democracy and human rights and freedoms, all come from the general population being informed. So it's important. It's really important. So, and I'm not the only person in the community who's starting to think of this. There's all kinds of pieces, and in some ways, this list, we've done a little bit of all of these, and I'm just going to give you some examples of thinking about data for communication purposes, about data in our everyday lives, about data in a conversation, about the idea of open data, about data as a new medium, and the democratization of data, which is where I will end up. So communication of data in outreach, like museums, libraries, and public spaces. I'll just again point out really quickly. So this was in an art gallery about Canadian artist Emily Carr, and an interactive visualization that put the pieces that were on display in context of her life's work. Probably many of you know about the Bohemian Bookshelf. This is for a library. The idea here was to use visualization to change search from a targeted search into a search that supported serendipity. This was actually a really fun project. We went back and read the 3 Princes of Serendip and looked from literature about what serendipity involved. And actually, there are several programmable aspects of how they actually talk about serendipity. And several people who use this actually told us that they felt lucky. So it's cool, it can be done. This is a recent one. So Calgary sort of has a big focus on the north. Eric Donovan is there because there's no better place to study the Aurora Borealis. So we did an outreach. So this is a proxemic interaction. So each strip is a kilogram That's a slice through the night sky. So this is like from the evening starting. So now by moving to the center, you can actually focus on where the aurora is. And I'll show you how it works proximically. So like if you're just walking by and you didn't think you were going to pay any attention to it, it responds to you moving so that you can see that, and it draws you in. So that's a public installation piece. So data in everyday life. I'm just going to do kind of one or two examples from all the way through this. Data in everyday life. So this is one of Alice Thutt's piece. She was looking at, because she's an avid traveler, and we all now, pretty much all of us, carry a cell phone. So that means you have time and location data that's with you all the time. And actually, if you visualize it from common smartphone data, mostly what you'll get is something like this, little pins on a map, which is cool. But what it does is it emphasizes the time you were in the car or on the bus, and it de-emphasizes the cities or the places that you visited. And that's not the way you think about your travel. So we just took that the other way and made a spatial temporal timeline where you could expand your places and compress the travel bits so you could get the kind of emphasis that you felt was right for your trip. And you could customize it. So we put this on the web and we asked people, they could volunteer to share what they'd done with us. And out of some 8,000 visits, 18 people shared theirs with us. That's just geometrically how it happens. So this is kind of what we expected. This is somebody's trip from Toronto to Montreal, and that's kind of the way we thought that, and the kind of trips that we thought people would actually use this for, and it worked fine for that. This was a little surprising. This is my walk in an English country garden. So he had fine enough data on his phone or equipment that he could actually trace his path through a park. This is my trip to everywhere, and they actually wrote to us about, well, actually I can't make them big enough anymore because I've been to so many places, there's not enough space. Yes. And this was in some ways one of the kinds of opposites to that, like they'd spend a really long time in certain parts of Ireland. This is over 5 years. This one is the extreme, my trip to nowhere. I stayed in San Francisco. But this one, somebody actually had the accurate historic data. Ben Johnson's walk from London to Scotland is a famous event, and they plotted this in visits, which is a different kind of aspect of personal data. It's data that they had that they were interested in. So that's visits of visualization in our everyday lives. But part of visualizations in our everyday lives is in discussion, right? So what if you want to plan a canoeing trip, and the lengths of roads are readily available on maps, but the lengths of rivers are not so available. So here you can trace your rivers and pull them out and develop your own little river bar chart. And this is, this is real time. It works like this. You could use it like that. So it's just, the idea is that just to be able to do something casually with what's actually available, like on the web, an image that you might be looking at anyway, that you want to be able to actually access the data within it a bit, right? And they take this similar, well, it's exactly the same idea. This is a different, this is actually sports data. So this is soccer, and this is Liverpool versus Manchester. And we all know as InfoVis people that bar charts are supposed to be more readable, right? So you can just similarly pull it off and get yourself a bar chart. But maybe actually the grays are the draws. Maybe I'm only interested in the wins and the losses. So maybe I want to select the part of data I want in my Nightingale rows and put it back in. have just what I want, but what's even better is this is now adjustable. So I could choose what I want to show. So this is casual. This is maybe 95% accurate, but certainly enough for the gist, for carrying a conversation, and something that you could just use as part of talking with your friends. And that's transmogrifiers, and actually transmogrifiers.org exists, and you can turn your whole desktop into a transmogrifier if you feel like, make people dance on their heads and various things like that. Works with videos too. So open data, and I think partly as I started to feel like this is really what I was doing, I was approached by the National Energy Board, because the Canadian government, Trudeau, when he got elected, he told all of his ministers, this data that you have, that was collected with taxpayers' money, therefore it belongs to the people, therefore you must make it open and transparent. So the immediate response was to make deposits of data in whatever format it happened to be on the web. And actually, surprising thing is that a lot of people can actually really use that. It's not like that was nothing, that's something, right? But it's not actually very accessible or very readable. So we're working with them, and they give us a chunk of data that they'd like to work with, and we try and do something with it. The first one was on what they call energy futures, and that's where they take the current trends in energy sales and demand and try and predict into the future. The second one was on pipeline incident data, much more controversial, actual incidents that happened, and they're divided up according to what province they're in and whether there was fire or leakage or what kind of incident it was. Yes, you can pick them out where they are on the map. This is still very much an ongoing problem and ongoing project that we are currently working with what they call their conditions data. So that's if somebody applies to make a pipeline or a change in a pipeline, they will get given a bunch of conditions, and that they have to get approved before they can go forward. So it's really interesting because it's text data and it's quasi-legalese, so pretty challenging, but that's where we are right now. But this is a question, is this working? And many of you probably know, Jeremy Boy did a whole PhD on visualization literacy and how much as people actually out there understanding of the visualizations that we put out. And the answer is not half as much as we would like, that this is maybe not working all that well. And also a little bit earlier, Melanie Torrey had done that study about how do novices make visualizations, and even giving them a computer visualization specialist to work with them, they didn't have an easy time. And that kind of shook me up a bit because I was thinking, like, that's what I thought would work. Like, that's what we all as a community think would work. You give them a visualization specialist and, should work. So somewhere around then, I started actually talking about, what could you do to improve visualization literacy? And one of the things is how do we become verbally literate, right? We actually spend 12 years making ourselves verbally literate. And what does that mean? What do we mean? Well, definitely that you can read, definitely that you can critique, but also that you can write. And we don't need everybody to be a Shakespeare, but we do need you to be able to write a decent letter. So we need, literacy has to have all of those things. So then what are we actually offering to the public when we make these things? We're offering them things to read, to look at. Maybe you can say we're offering them critique because there is a growing community in the web that is putting energy into writing blogs about tearing apart which visualizations they like and don't like. And I actually think this is probably beneficial for everybody because this is part of becoming literate, is to have a discussion about what you can and can't read. But writing, authoring, it's missing. Like, it's missing entirely. So maybe that's what we should think about. generating one's own visualizations. And I don't know if any of you have listened to Brett Victor. He's like really on about this. And he said, okay, the problem is that right now we have 3 things that we can do if you want to generate a visualization. You can use somebody else's visualization, templates and stuff. And that's like in Excel, in Tableau, Many Eyes, they all work like that. You have your data and you put it into an existing visualization. And that actually is moderately doable for people, but not really very expressive. You can sketch your own visualization. You can have data and you can draw something that visualizes it. And that's very expressive, but then, the next day rolls along and you have a new bit of data and you've got to start all over again. So it's not really useful in the same kind of way. Or you can code, and code is expressive, and it is flexible, and it does let you make dynamic visualizations, but not everybody can code. And maybe it's not a reasonable thing to think that everybody should code. Maybe in 20 or 30 years, everybody will be coding, but we have this gap. We have right now, we have a lot of adults who are not going to go back and do 3 or 4 years of training, right? So how can we help them? And Brett says it's totally important that the people feel this is expressive, that they're not just doing something by rote. So we looked first at this data sketching thing, partly because I don't know if you know, but we are a kind of data sketching lab. One of the things we do is we sketch all the time. Sometimes we have actually, like in art schools where you have, life drawing one night a week. Sometimes we have data sketching one night a week. So we've been doing it informally for a long time, and we thought, well, what if we actually just look at this process of data sketching? So we ran a study, and we gave people one of my favorite data sets. I don't know if you guys know it. It's at the back of SPSS, so if you want it, it's very accessible. It's about behavior, about when it's rude to burp and shout, and where it's okay to kiss and not. And yes, you could read it, and it's amusing, right? So it's great. You can bring, and also what's also good about this is I can bring anybody in as participants, and they're experts. They have their own opinion about whether it's okay to sleep in a job interview or not. Right? So it's and you can see they come in and they're chuckling away to themselves. They're actually kind of having fun with it. So that's cool. And people made us all kinds of visualizations. And obviously we got some tallies, like they're just counting the numbers. That's fine. That's a type of viz. Obviously we got lots of bar charts, lots and lots of different kinds of bar charts. We got some really weird and wonderful decision support tools, paths through the day and what to look up to know how to behave in class and in the lunchroom and things like that. And we also got these comic strips. And I don't know, some of you probably know I've been kind of doing more with comics these days. And initially when I'm collecting them up for the participants, I thought, I guess they weren't very interested in the data, which is fine. Participants get to do what they want, right? So there's a couple of things. And one is we categorized all of the things we got from this scale from numeracy, like whether it's really countable and you could just pick the data out by counting it out, to whether it's completely abstract and pictorial, and didn't seem like you could do that. And we asked people at the end to tell us anything that they found interesting about the data, and that there were no wrong answers. And people told us things about individual data points, like the thing I said about that they couldn't believe that somebody rated it as non-zero to sleep in a job interview. And about trends across 2 or 3 items or across 2 or 3 columns. And then you started to get into where they're relating it to the external world. So this is kind of categorization of different kinds of levels of insights until you get all the way to the end where they were actually making kind of fledgling initial conjectures that you could even run another study on, like that they bet that there were more women than men in the participants of the initial study because it was very acceptable to talk in public bathrooms. And that speaks of a whole understanding of culture in relation to the data that they're looking at, right? But cool when you put them together. So the green are the data comments that people have made, and the orange are the type of visualization, and the across a row is a participant. And so you can see some of our participants gave us like up to 5 visualizations. Some of them like sketching up a storm there. The comic strips are the P's, the dark brown, and the very numeric ones are the very pale ones. And the dark green are the conjectures, the people with the most insight into the data. Now, this is a qualitative study. This is not definitive, but this is interesting. Those people who are giving me comic strips had paid attention to the data, definitely. Right? So that's actually really interesting that actually this was a kind of profound engagement to them. And, I'm not going to talk more about it, but I mean, going forward with this notion of, graph comics and comics for data viz and like communicating that way, which I think is super interesting. But we are still in this sketch thing. We still have this problem that Brett pointed out that, you sketch something and you can't add data to it. It's not dynamic. It's really very limited. And so I started talking about like how we needed to have some kind of kindergarten viz. And that was right about when Samuel Huron joined our lab. And so this are the trio of people that we primarily got inspiration from. The first one is Froebel, and he invented kindergarten. And he invented kindergarten at a time when the community was shifting from a bartering society to a money-based society. And people were talking about things like, well, you can't expect people to be able to add and subtract, and you can't expect us to be able to teach them because like there's not even no schools, there are no teachers available. So how could we do that? Like it's not scale upable. And I kind of think we're in the same position in our shift to a data society. We kind of think, oh, well, there isn't really anything that we can do to bring everybody along. So Froebel said, if you give children the right toys, they will learn these abstract concepts by themselves. And he invented kindergarten and gave people wooden building blocks. And actually, you all learned that 1 and 1 makes 2 from wooden building blocks. And Piaget came along and formalized it and said, if this actually works, people learn when they're playing, they learn better and easier and faster and can learn. Like if you give them the right toys, they will learn a whole bunch of abstract concepts all by themselves. They don't actually really even need a teacher. So, and Papard had said, well, a lot of this actually applies to computers, and he came up with all kinds of great things, including Lego mindsets. So we thought, okay, can we do this? Does it apply to visualization? Can we do constructive visualization? And so we ran a study, and where we gave them one of Froebel's gifts, little colored tiles. I think actually the first study we actually used his little wooden tiles. And we asked people to create a visualization. And we gave them financial data because again, we wanted to use people just as they came off the street and we figured everybody's got a bank account. So they have some familiarity with financial data. And it was pretty simple data we gave them. Gave them 3 months. And the story we told them is, you have a friend that you know has been not managing their money so well, and you haven't wanted to say anything because, you don't want to embarrass them. But now they've asked you for help. So could you create a visualization of their financial data, which we'll give to you, so that they can understand what's happening? And because of all that we'd heard up until now, actually one of the things that we wrote down that we thought we were going to be measuring is how long it took people to start. Like from when we gave them the data and the tiles and said, make us a viz, how much thinking were they going to have to do to get going making a viz? And actually, the truth of the matter, that's our setup. The truth of the matter is that it didn't take them any time at all. So this is speeded up. So we asked them to create the visualization, and then we gave them another month. So we asked them to update it. So this is where the update part comes, and you can see that she actually quite radically changes her visualization. And then we said, well, your friend hasn't arrived, so can you annotate it so that they can understand it when you're not there? And as you can see, some people were starting working on their viz as they were sitting down. There was no gap time, and there was no hesitation. And they were just having fun playing around with these blocks and going to town. And they made us all kinds of visualizations, just like with the sketches, right? And at the end, we were looking at, analyzing, and we have a whole paper on analyzing the different kinds of processes they use. There's a couple things that I wanted to point out here that I think are kind of like more lasting. And one is that of the people that we had, 10 of them did bottom up. And so that means they took one piece of data and they put it next to another piece of data. No structure at this point, no actually overarching image of how the whole thing was going to work. 2 people made their axes and put the data in it. But most people just started putting the data together, assembling it. And all of our software and all of our templates and all of the ways we try and talk to people about it, it's top down. So thinking about what bottom-up tools are, this is a definite call. It's something we should think about. Also, and I should have switched it to American money, but you know that that's money, right? Might not look like real money to you, but it is money. and like if I was going to if I gave you that, you might say, why are you giving me Canadian money? But you probably wouldn't say, why are you giving me that piece of paper? So this is a token. And if it was an American $20 bill, you would totally just think of it as $20 and what it's worth. It's a token, and we have completely internalized that tokenization. So I was interested in what the people thought they were manipulating. So we asked them, during this task, what were you manipulating? Because I wanted to know, did they say I was manipulating tiles? I was manipulating data? And actually, most people gave us some kind of conflated statement. I was manipulating tiles that represented data. I was manipulating data which are represented by these tiles. Some way or another, they were conflated the two in an hour of playing with them. So this willingness that we have to map data onto a token, it's right there. So it's somehow, to me, this is like, okay, there is a way in here with this constructive viz that this is accessible, that people were not intimidated. They just felt like they could do it, even though, they'd never done anything before. We ran this in Paris, and we just asked people walking along the street if they could exchange an hour of their time for a coupon to a cafe. So it was just people. And subsequently with Jeremy and John Daniel, we've designed a whole peer process of using this kind of visualization and talking to each other that actually seems to be hugely empowering and hugely exciting. One of the first ones that Jeremy and Samuel ran was in kind of a fair, so there was roller coasters and other kinds of things like that competing, and people who came into this room stayed in the whole 3 hours and did it from beginning to end. They were choosing it over, they were doing it for pleasure, which is pretty cool. And Jeremy now works for the UN, and he sent me a couple of pictures where he's actually working with different governments, helping them actually think with data. So this isn't the data they're working with, but in doing this, they learn how you can learn from data. So they learn what the thinking with data is all about. And I think this is like super important and very empowering. So we subsequently ran a study back in the lab about, okay, what is the difference? What is the difference between making it with tiles and making it in Excel? And this was a kind of more controlled study where the same person did both. And initially we were kind of thinking, because, people were faster in Excel, And if you ask them, they said, well, yeah, Excel is like easier, right? But then when we actually watched what they were doing and talked to them in more detail about what they were doing, when they're manipulating the tiles, they are manipulating the data. Their operations are data operations. When they're using Excel, they're learning how to use the interface, where to find how to change the color, where to find how to change the width of the bars, right? So that they are learning about the interface, not about the data. And I think this is an important distinction. And if we're thinking about empowering people, we have to think of ways that we can let them experience working with data. Okay, so taking that, this is a new piece of analysis that she will be, it's a Chi paper this year. She was working with individual people, giving them a toolkit for constructive visualization, for them to do a individual personal streaming data physicalization of their own data. And the different participants chose all kinds of different things, from pain to ability to concentrate to exploration in a new city, to a way of labeling homemade products. And you can see the visualizations that they came with are radically different. And they all had pretty profound personal revelations from doing this work. So, and we did run a workshop teaching them basic things about how to do visualization, again with the same kind of peer training thing. Nobody had trouble. Nobody talked to us about the trouble. So that's also pretty exciting. But maybe authoring is not enough. Remember when we went back and we were thinking about what makes us literate? There's reading, critiquing, and authoring. And I think all of these still have huge amounts of places to do more research. But we thought we would look a little bit into the notion of active reading. So actually, in school, when they're teaching you how to read, they also teach you all kinds of techniques, which by the time you're in university, you've sublimated. You're not even thinking about them. But you have, some of you highlight, some of you use marginalia, some of you use notes. You probably all use something. And all of these are active reading techniques. And we all know how to read, but we don't assume that we can just look at a passage and fully understand it at its depth. And somehow we have this notion, we show somebody a new visualization and we think that they're going to look at it and understand it instantly. And actually, we as people, we never work like that. It's going to take some time. And actually, there are all kinds of tools and techniques that we can think about that might help. We can actually think about designing tools for active reading, and I think for all kinds of visualizations. So we did, this is a book if you want to know about how to read a book. It's all about active reading for people who can already read. When you want to get more out of a book, when you want to get the in-depth insight. So the first thing we did is, if we ask people to do this on a computer, we know that they're not going to do any active reading because there's no support for it. They're just going to look at the screen and try and figure out what they can. So we had to go back to paper, give them visualizations on a paper. And the first question is, do people do any active stuff? Do they just look, what do they do, right? And so now we'll see if this works. This is my slide that is huge, but it's got all of these videos happening. So these are 6 people given simple social network graphs, and they're asked, I should have read the questions on the previous slide. They're asked things like who loves who loves somebody, who doesn't love them back. So they're reading the visualizations, and you can see that they're all doing things. They're taking notes, they're writing on them, they're picking them up, they're turning them around. They're all doing things. They're all actually very active. In our usual inimitable form, we categorized all of these kinds of actions, view-preserving actions, view-altering actions with different purposes, recognizing, tracking, reorganizing, decoding, analyzing, different things that people were doing with different actions. And then we thought we will just take one addition we can make to software that covers quite a few of these. Like it covers this several tracking and following actions, so that it covers quite a few different things. Would have let people do that. So we did more formal study, more controlled study of a free-form annotation overlay for graph tasks, because we started with graphs. And it's interesting. Just like with active reading, when you do active reading, you read slower. You learn more, but you read slower. And when you make use of a free-form annotation overlay to help yourself read a visualization, you spend more time, but you're way more accurate. And when you're watching people, you could see that some of the more complex tasks, they just guessed because it was too complex. It was too much to keep in their head at once, right? Where they could do it with an overlay. So yeah, back to visualization for an informed society and this kind of research agenda. So I think there are all kinds of questions about what visualization authoring can be for more people than those of us who have a computing science background. And can we actually expand that so it includes expression, so that people actually feel like they enjoy doing it and they're getting something out of it? Active reading for all kinds of visualizations. One simple free-form annotation overlay is a step, but it's just this little tiny step in that direction. And I didn't actually go in because I haven't really done anything, but this whole notion of critique, do we really want to leave it to one or two people who write blogs? Don't we really want to actually start a more active discussion? Don't we actually want to have some influence about how critique is done, about what is considered good visualization? I think that's a whole other thing. And together, hopefully, we can build up a sense of literacy, but in building up a sense of literacy, maybe also have an understanding about what we can do with open data, like what it actually means to make data open and transparent, how I can actually have some idea whether I've done the right thing for this energy data that we're trying to do now. Then there's also this other thing. I went to one of the meetings from the National Energy Board where there were people, activists and people from the industry, and all kinds of people were standing up and presenting their point of view. And when they're actually standing up like I am here, they were all kind of being polite. But when they were all saying, well, you can't trust that data because it's regulators' data. You can't trust that data because it's industry data. Well, you can't trust that data because it's activists' data. Well, it's like, really? Okay. And I think that as a community, we've started to look at data provenance. And we've been looking at data provenance mostly from when we start visualizing it, what we do with the visualization. But I think there's this whole other level of provenance. Where does this data come from? Who collected it initially? Who's been storing it? Who's had access to it? All kinds of things that if we actually want to provide people data that they are going to trust, we have to actually think about provenance. And all of this, to me, comes together in this notion of data thinking, that I actually think that we as a community think in data, or start to a bit, and that really to be empowered, everybody needs to be able to do this. And just in this last year, we've run first year, so that's people coming in from high school, 17 and 18 years old, thinking in data classes, and we have just been full to the gills, like overfull and run a new session and overfull, and it's for anybody, right? And we're doing these kinds of activities of like thinking in data, but I think that they all know that it's the people who can think in data who are making the big bucks these days. Thinking in data means knowing how to move the right bit of information in the right kind of way to the right people, and all of a sudden it's worth something. Like, Uber doesn't buy taxis. Airbnb doesn't buy hotels. Facebook, Twitter, they're all just about getting the information out. So teenagers, they know this is what they really want to do. They want to be able to think in data because that's what's going to make them powerful in our society. And I think that thinking in data is something different from being able to manage a database. And that we need to think about what thinking in data is and how we can actually empower people generally, whatever subject they're taking, to be part of that. And that's thanks to my students, supporters, and collaborators.